Welcome back. Let's think about tax incidence and who bears the burden of a tax. So maybe the best way to think about this is to look at two different examples. So let's look at one where we have inelastic demand and elastic supply, and let's look at one where we have elastic demand and inelastic supply. So we're just going to flip them around and see if we can make sense of this. So to do this, we're going to need to set up two supply and demand diagrams. One for inelastic demand, so inelastic demand, and elastic supply. And our other example, we just want to flip this around, so we'll look at elastic demand. So elastic demand and inelastic supply. So what's an example of this? Maybe you think about gasoline in the short run, right? It's hard for us to change and move away from gasoline in the short run, but gasoline producers, rather than refining gasoline, they can use that crude oil to make other chemicals, other products, plastics, etc. But in the long run, our demand is much more elastic. We can move closer to work. We can figure out how to commute on bicycle. Maybe we get a moped. Maybe we buy a more fuel-efficient car, etc. But that takes us time. But gasoline producers, refiners, supply is probably actually less elastic in the long run. Right? In the short run, they can make these other chemicals or whatnot, but the world only needs so much kerosene. Eventually, that huge quantity of production capacity is going to have to go back to producing gasoline. So maybe we're stretching a little bit, but hopefully that helps us think about this idea a little bit more clearly. All right, so inelastic demand and elastic supply, what does that look like? So if we've got quantity and price, inelastic demand means that quantity demanded does not respond to price very much. So our demand curve is pretty steep, versus elastic supply means that quantity supplied responds to price. So our supply curve is much flatter. So once we've got this set up, we can find our non-tax price. I'm just going to call it P0, right? P0, the price without a tax. You can label it price without a tax, but that's a lot of letters to fit in there and they won't be readable. So I'm just going to call it P0. All right, so now suppose a tax is put in place. What does the tax do? It drives a wedge between what the buyer pays and what the seller receives. So the supply curve and the demand curve are vertically separated by the amount of the tax. So we can just arbitrarily sort of draw in a vertical line that represents our tax. Right? This difference, that's the amount of our tax. So who's bearing the burden in this case? Well, the buyer is paying considerably more than they did before the tax was put in place. And the seller, they're receiving a little bit less, but not nearly as much as the buyer's paying in addition. So this buyer, they're paying a lot more for every gallon of gasoline, if that's our example, than they were before. So of the tax revenue, a lot of it is coming from the buyer, right? So this is the buyer's burden. And the seller, we can sort of dot in their lost revenue. So that's the seller's burden. So notice as we set this up, that the buyer's burden is much larger than the seller's burden. So I guess we could put a little note, maybe we'll just put it down below. So buyer's burden is greater than the seller's burden. What if the flip side is true? What if demand is elastic, buyers have alternatives, and supply is inelastic, producers don't have many alternatives? So let's set that one up and see what we can learn. So we'll set up another supply and demand diagram. I'm going to set them up somewhat similar in terms of size. So we've got price, quantity, but how do we draw in these curves? So demand is elastic. That means that demand, the quantity demanded, responds a lot to price. So our demand curve is relatively flat. And supply is inelastic. So that means our supply curve is relatively steep. So you want to draw your supply curve in closer to the vertical and your demand curve closer to the horizontal. So if we find our equilibrium price, so before a tax is put in place, so we'll again call this P0, P0, and the tax drives a wedge between buyers and sellers. So in this case, how much is the buyer paying? Well, they're paying a little bit more than they were before, but the seller is receiving a lot less than before the tax. So we can follow our same notation as we did in the other one. We'll sort of slash in the buyer's burden, right? So that's our buyer's burden. Buyer's burden. And we'll dot in the rectangle for the change in price times quantity, right? This is our lost revenue to the seller, right? So that's our seller's burden. And let's put our notes down below. So in this case, the buyer's burden, so the buyer's burden is less than the seller's burden. All right, let's see if we can find the pattern. You've probably already found it. So in our first example, the buyers were the inelastic party. All right, we said demand was inelastic and supply was elastic. And in our second example, the buyers, we said, were elastic. We had elastic demand. And the sellers were inelastic. So what's our takeaway from both of these? Our takeaway is that the burden of a tax falls more heavily on the inelastic party. Inelastic party. How do we say that in plain English terms? Who's the elastic party? It's the one with alternatives. It's the one that can do something else, right? That's why their quantity responds to price. They have more options. So who ends up bearing the burden of a tax? It's the party that doesn't have other options, so the tax burden gets pushed to them. Hopefully you're starting to get a feel for this idea of elastic versus inelastic parties, who bears the burden of a tax, and how can we think through where the tax is going to fall when politicians say, oh, don't worry about it. You're not going to pay anything more. We're going to tax the oil companies and the gasoline companies. And you think, I think I'm the inelastic party here. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.